Good evening, I'm Larry Souter, and welcome to Stories of Amazing Grace. We come to you from Bixter Chapel at the Madison Church of Christ in Madison, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us on the internet, watching on TV, listening to the radio, and of course for this live audience. Our theme scripture comes from Romans 8:38 through 39, and I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love, neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither our fears for today nor our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. Our guest tonight is Stephen Allen Young. He has a book entitled From Chains, C-H-A-I-N-S, to Change, C-H-A-N-G-E. Be warned that it is an honest and raw read book, but a good read. Well, Stephen Allen Young describes the book and himself this way. Let me read this to you. Like many cities across America, Nashville faces a growing homeless population. Where do these people come from? Why are they here? And more importantly, what keeps them from moving forward? In this unflinching story of amazing grace, Stephen Allen Young, founder and executive director of Home Street Home Ministries, peels back his own layers to reveal many of those answers. But it goes deeper than just homelessness. Weighted down by chains of guilt and shame, Stephen grew to live for the moment. He partied, slept around, manipulated people for his own purposes and desires, became a con, a thief, and an addict. His choices led to 4 failed marriages, and he spent over 8 years in prison, which eventually left him broke, alone, and homeless on the streets of Nashville. In 2013, when he decided to end it all, the very God he despised stepped in, and his long healing journey from chains to change began. This painfully honest and powerfully redemptive story exemplifies God's ability to heal, transform, and restore, and offer hope for the future. And you'll meet Stephen Allen Young right after this video.
At 52 years of age, my life kind of fell apart. The recession hit, my business collapsed. Divorce wasn't far behind that, and the snowball just started rolling. And the next thing I knew, I found myself with nowhere to go, nowhere to turn, and living on the streets of Nashville. Didn't think it would last very long, but it lasted 5 years. Once I got off the streets, I couldn't forget everything that I learned and saw while I was there. And so literally starting out of the trunk of my car with a couple of friends, working out of our own pockets, I went back to the streets and started doing what I could do to help those that weren't as fortunate as me, that were still out there. And from that, Home Street Home was born.
Stay warm now, brother.
When I started Home Street Home, I did so because while I was homeless, I found out what was being done, but I also found out what wasn't being done. So I decided someone needed to step in and fill in those gaps. And for the last several years, we have done that by making sure they have what they need to survive, whether it be food, clothing, tents, sleeping bags, heaters in the wintertime, insect repellent in the summertime. We've given out tons and tons of life-saving and life-giving supplies.
I mean, they gave me a tent, sleeping bags for me and my brother, food, heater. I mean, without all that, this winter, I couldn't do nothing. Couldn't go nowhere.
This morning while we were out on one of our regular routes, we came across one of our friends, Steve. He was literally laying in the dirt, covered by only a tarp. A few days before that, he had fallen and broken his foot. You could see the cast. He didn't even have shoes on. He had been trying to make it back to his camp, and good, that's as far as he got. And he had been there for 2 days.
Welcome, Stephen Allen Young. Come on up. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, I read the book. The book is raw.
It's real.
It's
raw.
honest. You start off by talking about your family. It's safe to say you came from a dysfunctional family, I would say.
That's putting it politely.
Yeah. And these are the brothers and
Yep.
father and mother.
That's the only photo that I have, the entire family.
And where are you?
I am right there. I was next to the youngest.
Okay. Well, the public perception of the family was different than reality. Tell me about that.
My family, my parents, were very abusive, both of them. A lot of times you'll hear, well, one parent was, one parent wasn't. My parents kind of vied for the number one position in that area. My father was very physically abusive. Mother was too, but she was more psychological and emotionally abusive. There were times I didn't go to school for a couple of weeks because the bruises had to clear up first.
Really?
Because they didn't want to be seen. But my parents were all about appearances. So every time the church door opened, we were there, which was fine with me because for that 2.5 hours, I knew I wasn't going to be beat. I knew I wasn't going to be told how stupid I was, how worthless I was. I wasn't going to be screamed at.
So that was a safe place.
That was my safe place. Back in that time, in that era, child abuse wasn't a thing like it is today. And I look back at it now, and I just have to realize, I have to believe that some people knew what was going on, but they just kept their mouth shut because that's what you did back then. And so it was a not a good place to be. At 12 years of age, I was saved, baptized, but a little over 3 months later, that all got ripped away from me.
You were sexually abused.
I went to my first summer church camp, and the third night there, I was molested by one of the deacons. That was probably the most horrible point in my life as I look back on it now. And it was then too, because at that moment, my only safe haven got ripped away from me. At that point, at the age of 12, I didn't think there was a safe place that would ever exist for me again. So when I got back home, my parents kind of knew something was wrong because I wasn't eating, I wasn't coming out of my room, and they just kept hounding me. What's wrong with you? And nothing. And I said nothing for two reasons. One was shame, but the other was also fear, because I was afraid of how they would respond. I was afraid that I would be beaten. Something would happen to me that caused that fear to exist and for me to keep my mouth shut for quite a while. And I really wasn't wrong, because one day my mother said something to me and it's just like, okay. And it just came all pouring out. And I don't use the term mom and dad too often because there was nothing maternal or paternal about my parents. My father looked at me. The first thing out of my father's mouth was, "What did you do to make him think that's what you wanted?" And again, I was 12 years old. My mother looked at me and she said, "Well, he's a deacon, and you're you. I don't believe you. Nobody else is going to believe you, and the family doesn't need that embarrassment." So we don't ever talk about this again. I was 52 years old before anybody else in this world knew what happened to me.
So you kept that in all these years.
All these years. All those years.
That must have ate at you terribly.
It did. It stayed with me, and it was literally at that moment, as I say in my book, that's when I started my journey down the road of I don't give a damn. And I didn't. From that point on, because again, my parents were all about appearances. So I continued to have to go to church 3 times a week and see that man. And the abuse continued for a while. Mm-hmm. So when I turned 18, I didn't want to have anything to do with God, church, my parents, nothing. I literally, by that point, I'd become so numb, so jaded that I didn't care about anything or anybody but myself. And I think subconsciously more than consciously for a while, I started doing everything I could to tick for, I tried to come up with a nice word.
You're on your own, so live it up.
Yep. And tick God off. Because the subtitle to the book is One Man's Journey from God Hater to God Follower. And that's what my life was. It was a journey from one point to the other. But at that point, I truly hated God because I blamed him for everything.
But some youth directors took you in, and that seemingly was a good situation.
It seemingly was. I was kind of I didn't fit in with the youth group at church real well. But they were very, very accepting of me, and it was another safe place that just kind of came around, that I knew I could go over there, and we would go over there a lot of times as a group, the youth group would, to their house, and, we'd hang out, we'd, just have fun. And so I felt comfortable there. And I was one of the few that drove at that time, and I was never anxious to get home. So a lot of times I would hang around after everybody else had left. And her husband was a CPA. So during tax season, he worked late into the night. And one particular evening, we'd all been there, the youth group had been there and whatnot, so everybody had left, and I was kind of cleaning up and helping her out because I was in no hurry to go home. And one thing led to another, and we ended up in bed together. And that started a 2-year relationship. And for that 2 years, I was being told the minute I turned 18, she was going to leave her husband, we were going to get married, and we were going to live happily ever after. But one Sunday, I'm standing there ready to get into my car in the church parking lot, and her husband comes walking up behind me, and all he said, it was very simple, and it wasn't said out of anger, it was said very calmly. He said, I don't think you should be at our house if I'm not at home. So I knew that he now knew. And it wasn't long before I found out how he knew. And that's when I found out that she was pregnant. Never knew whether it was his or mine.
Still don't know?
Still don't know. Still don't know. But that was just another, it was kind of, it refueled the gas tank for that journey down that road. And when I turned 18, And they left the church not too long after that. You know, so I don't know if it was a boy or a girl or nothing. You know, I could have a child out there and I don't know. But really, literally at that point in my life, love, religion, God, it was all warped. It was all warped. I didn't know what normal was. And so I threw myself into myself. And it became all about me. And I did a lot of damage.
You were falsely accused of embezzling, weren't you, at Shoney's?
Yes, I was. And that during that era was when not long after I got arrested for that, is when I met my first wife. That's Andy. We met, and it was kind of instant.
Mm-hmm. You were smitten.
I was definitely smitten. But I still wasn't a good guy.
Yeah.
And
but did she know that? That you weren't a good guy?
It didn't take long
Okay.
for her to figure it out. And she's with us tonight. That's why I'm looking over there. I asked her to marry me, knowing that I may be going to prison.
How did she accept that?
She didn't know when I asked her. She found out
Oh, that's
a little
right.
later. Her brother did not like me, and he was not happy about the engagement, and so he tried his best to talk her out of marrying me, but she still did. And it wasn't long after we were married that I went to trial and was found guilty. And if there was ever a bright moment for me, or maybe bright's not the right thing to say, it was after the trial concluded and the jury went into deliberation. My parents did come up to me and said, "We're sorry. We thought you were lying. We thought you were guilty." And nobody believed I was going to be found guilty. Andy's stepfather at the time worked in the courthouse, and he even said, "There's no way the jury's coming back with a guilty plea." He said, "I've been here for 30 some odd years." He said, there's no way. Even my parents, there's no way. Well, guess what? There was a way, because they came back and I was found guilty. And that was my first trip to prison.
Were you working as a DJ at the time with a showboat, is that correct, when you saw Andy?
Yes.
And you wanted to be a DJ while you were living at home?
Yes, that was my dream job.
And you went to Nashville School of Broadcast Technique?
Yes,
Was
I
that
did.
81?
Somewhere around that time, yes.
Do you know I was one of the instructors there when you were there?
Oh, no, I don't.
I didn't teach you. I taught broadcast management.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 1981.
Yeah. But yeah, that was my dream job.
Yeah.
And but again, I wasn't a good person. And I look back now, and after years of therapy and some very good therapists, and God, mostly God, I realized why I did some of the things. But it ended for Andy and I when she found out that I got engaged to another woman while I was still married to her.
And you tried to pull the wool over her eyes by bringing back some fish. Tell me
Yes.
about that.
I had disappeared. I was going on a fishing trip, which I wasn't going on a fishing trip. We'll just leave the details at that. But on the way home, I stopped and bought some fish.
It wasn't frozen fish, was it?
No, it wasn't. But I stopped and bought some fish. But to Andy's credit, she stuck by me through the trial, and even after, I went in, she did file for divorce, but she still came to visit.
But you were so despondent over this situation that you attempted suicide on a bridge downtown. Tell me about that.
Yes, after everything that had gone on, and I knew I was headed to prison. The judge was Judge Raymond Leathers. he was very upset at the verdict, to be honest with you. And he said so to the DA, and he made a promise that he would do everything in his power that I did the minimum amount of time, and he told my mother and father if they ever needed anything or I ever needed anything to reach out to him. But he gave me plenty of time to get my affairs in order, basically to let me get through the holidays, because it was close to the holidays. But during that time, I just, the thought of going to prison and, and Andy and everything else, it was, there was nothing left for me. And I was done. And I drove around all day long, and I just found myself, I pulled up on the bridge. I believe it was the Shelby Street Bridge, and left the car running, put it in park, opened the door, and walked over, stepped over the railing, and I was about ready to jump. And it just so happened that a police officer pulled up as I was going over the rail, and it was a guy that I had gone to high school with. The officer was. And that was God's first intervention that I remember. I didn't realize it then. I do now.
You shortchanged death about 4 times, I think.
Yes, several times. And because I literally jumped. And as I jumped, he jumped and grabbed me, and his partner grabbed him. And I didn't know this because I went straight to Vanderbilt Hospital into the psychiatric ward. But there were, according to what Andy has told me and other aspects that Eric Wilson, who co-wrote the book with me, checked out, there were about 4,000 or 5,000 people gathered down there. It was a long stretch. They had the boats in the water and the whole 9 yards. Really? And front page, that's how she found out. She got a call from a reporter, and she hadn't seen the newspaper.
Let's see the shot here. You've been in 3 different prisons.
Yes.
Attorney Center, Logan County, Kentucky, Mississippi State.
Yes.
Tell me why you were there, and I want to get to what happened here later.
I became an addict, but not what most people think about when you say you were an addict. I was a gambling addict. That became my world that I could escape to. When I didn't want to face reality, when I didn't want to deal with who I really was, and for many, many years I felt just totally worthless. But I could go into a casino and I could throw some money down on a table, and all of a sudden I was somebody. And I was pretty good at it for a while. And I always made good money, legitimately, for the longest. So when you go into a casino and you're willing to spend and lose a few $1,000s, they treat you like you're royalty. Sure. So that became my escape. That was where the world disappeared, and I was Mr. Young. I wasn't worthless and stupid and all the things my parents told me I was. I wasn't, what happened to me at 12 years old. I was Mr. Young. And so I literally became addicted. However, I didn't know I had an addiction until I ran out of money. And for years, I had money, so it wasn't a problem. But the more I gambled, the more things started to fall apart. I wasn't making it to work, and if I did go to work, I wasn't doing my job properly, and it was just, and I moved to Memphis, and I was 30 minutes away from the casinos in Tunica. And that's when it all really kicked into high gear. And I was running a little restaurant down on Beale Street, and I would leave in the afternoon. I would go straight to the casino. Sometimes I would gamble all night long and go straight back to work and not having slept. And sometimes I'd go for 2 or 3 days not having slept. Well, you can imagine my performance at work kind of slipped. So when I ran out of money and couldn't get a job anymore, I started to put together a plan with another gentleman, and we started a burglary ring, and I was convicted of 80 plus burglaries in 3 different states, and that was the ones I was convicted of. So I ended up having to do time in Tennessee, which was Turney Center, and Kentucky, which was the Logan County Detention Center, and then my last stop was the Mississippi State Penitentiary, otherwise known as Parchman. And
Now, back in Logan, all these were bad, but this was not as bad. Mr. Bill was kind to you. Tell me about Mr. Bill.
Mr. Bill was the sheriff. Kentucky, a lot of people don't realize this, the sheriff in Kentucky is elected. Or not the sheriff, the jailer rather. The sheriff's department don't run the jails in Kentucky. The jailers are elected, and they hire their own people. And so I asked Mr. Bill, after being up there for a little while, I said, why do you do the things you do, for us? And he said, every person in here, with the exception of you, because you're not from here, he said, but every person in here represents at least 1 vote, if not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So if I'm good to them, who do you think their family is going to vote for when it's time for me to get reelected? And he and I had a unique bond. And I worked hard for him. When I was in Kentucky, I ran his kitchen. I had some restaurant experience. And so he said, would you like to stay here and do your time versus going to the state facility? And I said, sure. And he knew that I didn't have any family support whatsoever. So he kind of took me under his wing. He was, I don't know why, he saw something in me, I guess. But
your father died while you were at Logan.
My father passed away.
He took you out on a road trip, didn't he?
Right. 2 of my brothers came up to tell me, and it was right before Christmas. And I thought, they came up, I hadn't seen them for a while, but I was thinking it was because Christmas, maybe they found a heart, and decided to come up and at least say hello. Well, no, they came up to tell me that Dad had passed away. And so Mr. Bill did everything he could to get me to the funeral. But the problem was both governors, the Tennessee governor and the Kentucky governor, had to sign off on it. The Tennessee governor did, however, the Kentucky governor was on vacation and could not be reached because he was down in some island somewhere in time to get everything worked out. But 3 of the jail officers had already said they would escort me off the clock. 3 sheriff's deputies, because they needed 6, they said they would go off the clock as well, because the sheriff department would come by and I would wash their vehicles for them, because they knew I wasn't getting any support, and they would pay me to wash their vehicles. And I would also fix burgers and sandwiches and all for them if they wanted to stop by. And I'll never forget, I asked Mr. Bill, I hadn't been there long, and I said, Mr. Bill, I said, do we have anybody here that can cut hair? And he said, you want a haircut? And I said, don't you think I need one? And he said, yeah. And I said, yes, I would like a haircut. And he says, all right, come with me. So we walk into his office, and he gets on the phone. He calls up someone, and I hear him go, I've got one of my guys up here that needs a haircut. Do you have any openings today? And he said, okay, I'll send him. And so He hung up and he said, you know where the square is, right? It was like 3 blocks away. I said, yeah. He said, all right, there's a beauty shop there. She's waiting on you. And she'll take good care of you. And I said, okay, who's going to escort me? He said, it's a beautiful day, Stephen. He said, it's only 3 blocks. You're not going anywhere, are you? I said, no, sir, I'm not. So I literally walked up, got my hair done. He told me to take my time walking back. It was a pretty day, just be back in time to serve dinner. And so I did. So that was the relationship that we had. So when he could not get it arranged for me to attend the funeral, he came that day and picked me up. And we spent the entire day. We went to antique shops. We drove around. We went out to lunch. I ended up having dinner with him and his family in his home. And about 10 o'clock that night, he took me back.
You said in your book, if that wasn't God giving me glimpses of his love, I didn't know what was.
True.
Well, that's the good place, supposedly.
Yeah.
But this place here, you were gang raped. That weighs heavily on you, doesn't it? As it should.
Yes. That was the one story that was never going to come out. Eric Wilson wrote Fireproof and Facing the Giants, New York Times bestselling author. He's the one that talked me into doing this book. I'd known him for a few years. And I didn't want to do it because I didn't want to go back down certain roads. And this was one of those roads that I swore I would never go back down. But Eric's very good at what he does. And he kept telling me, there's something you're not telling me. But we literally got to the end of the book. And as far as I'm concerned, we were done. You know, final edit, we were ready to turn it over to the publisher and roll with it. And I'll never forget, we were sitting in my office at the house, and he said, okay, if you're good with this, we'll send it. But he said, there's something, I know, Stephen, there's something you're not telling me. And I said, I've never denied that. I said, but I'm not going to go back down that road. And he said, that's your decision. He said, but God is telling me somebody needs to hear it. Somebody out there needs to hear it. He said, but it's your final decision. So I said, give me the weekend, because this was on a Friday. And I called him up Monday, and I said, okay, we'll do this, but here's the ground rules. You're going to come in, we're going to go into the office, you're going to sit down, and I'm going to talk. And you better write fast, because you're not going to be able to ask any questions, and I'm only going through it one time. I said, do you understand that? And he said, yes. And so he did. He came over, and nobody knew what happened to me. Mike Dotson didn't even know what happened to me. And he knew everything else there was to know about me until that book came out. And I'll never forget, Andy goes, were you going to tell me about it? I said, nope. I said, I will let you read it before it's published. I said, under one condition. I said, we don't talk about it. And she said, okay. And of course she read it, and we were fixing to send it off to the publisher. And she said, I just want to say one thing. And I said, you know what we agreed to? And she says, no, we're not going to talk about it. She looked at me and she said, it changes nothing. That was a love I'd never known on this earth. when she said that to me. This book is as hard as it was for me to write, has been the second most healing aspect of my later years. My wife, and we never mentioned that so far, but she was obviously, as you've guessed by now, my first wife. And there were 40 years where we didn't see or talk to each other. We didn't even know if each other was still alive. And one day, and it just happened coincidentally to be on my birthday, I'm on Facebook thanking everybody for the birthday wishes, and the messenger window pops up, and it's her after 40 years. She reached out. And we're fixing to celebrate our 4th anniversary in October this time around.
I have a shot of your second marriage here, which is your forever marriage.
Yes.
Let's talk about your home street home ministry a little bit, how this came about.
Okay.
And this is the corner where you used to sell the contributors.
Yes, this is the corner I stood on for almost 5 years, every day just about. And one day, this guy, who's with us today, came pulling up. And he came up and he said, I don't know if you've had breakfast or not, but I bought you a sausage and biscuit. And he said, and I don't know if you like cheese, but so I went ahead and licked it off. That was our first meeting. And that was about the length of our first meeting. And I said, thank you. And I turned around and just kind of ignored him. And he went away. But he came back. And he kept coming back. And he kept coming back. And he will tell you I had a very high, thick wall around me. And it wasn't easy. It was months before he ever knew my last name. But the amazing thing about Mike was he only asked me to church one time. And he was a deacon at Tusculum Church of Christ. Now he's an elder at Tusculum Church of Christ. And I hadn't been going in a while, obviously. But he asked, but he only asked once. And he never asked again. And it was over a year later that one Sunday morning I walked back through a church door. And it was his church. And he didn't even know I was coming. And the reason was, and I tell when I speak to churches now, is because he only asked once. But you know what the follow-up was to that was? Even when I didn't show up the next Sunday, or the next Sunday, or the next Sunday, or the next Sunday, or the next Sunday, he kept coming back. And sometimes he'd just drive by and say, I'm on my way to an appointment, but I was in the area and I just wanted to swing by and say, hey, I'll come back when I can spend some more time with you. Sometimes he'd pull up and he'd have a pizza and he'd sit right there on the curb with me and have lunch. Sometimes he would take me to lunch, as long as I agreed to go to the restaurant he wanted to go to, you know.
And one time he gave you money.
Yeah, Mike went to, Mike's the reason I'm sitting here, folks. He's the reason I'm still here. And he is definitely the reason I'm sitting inside a church. He had a little men's Bible study group that met at the McDonald's where I stood every Thursday. And we'd kind of built up a relationship. And I still didn't like him very much, but, you know, he got on my nerves. But he went to his buddies there. And he said, I think it's time we get Stephen off the streets. So they all pitched in, and I looked at some places I could go and found a place. And so Mike got the money together, and he gave it to me. And the next day, he called and said, well, did you get moved in? And I fabricated this big lie, because what I'd done with that money was I'd gone straight to the casino and lost every penny of it.
It was,
And,
how much was it?
It's $700. And so it was a couple of days later when he finally said, "So now you want to tell me what really happened?" And he said, "Okay." He said, "No problem. This is just a new starting point, and it's a lesson for both of us. I've learned you're not ready to handle money yet. So it's no big deal." He took me to my first Gamblers Anonymous meeting, sat in the parking lot and waited for me till it was over. He went back to the other gentlemen and paid them back out of his pocket for what they had given and told them what I had done. And then he met me and paid for my first month's rent out of his own pocket. And that was March of 2013, and I've been off the streets ever since.
And you started Home Street Home as a result of Mike influencing you.
Yes. He kept on me and said, we need to do something. So we started just literally out of our own pockets, the trunk of our cars, and he put up the $600 we needed to get things rolling. And so we just started doing what I knew to do, what I'd learned in my 5 years of living it. And one thing led to another, to another, to another, and we finally became an official nonprofit. We founded, I'll never forget, we sat around and, tried to think of what we were going to call this thing. And we were sitting in my McDonald's, what we used to call my office back in the day. And we were scribbling things down, and I was sitting there, and I'm just going, home sweet home, no, dun, 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 my boom. And it just hit me. And I wrote it down, and I said, this is it right here. And so his employer, his boss, gave us the money to get the nonprofit put together. And we are now the largest in Nashville.
Really? What are some misconceptions people have about the homeless?
It's their fault. They're just drug addicts. They're just alcoholics. They're just lazy.
You had a preacher comment in your book here. Someone came up to you and said, I've been preaching for 40 years. If you just turn your life over to Jesus, he'll get you out of this. And you replied, what makes you think I haven't?
That's right. He was something else. And I looked at him and I said, I think it's awesome that you've been, preaching the gospel those many years. I said, but can you tell me what book, chapter, and verse it says that? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, you said if I just give my life over to Jesus, that he would get me out of this. I said, again, can you tell me what book, chapter, and verse it says that? Because I'm going to tell you right now, no offense, that book, that chapter, that verse doesn't exist. And I said, I know Jesus, and I know Jesus well, and I know God well. His promises to us aren't about here. He makes one promise to us about our life here on earth. He will never forsake us. That's the only promise. Every other promise happens after we leave this earth. It's like the old country song. I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. And nowhere in the Bible did it promise us a rose garden. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, well, if you just give your life over to God, if you'll accept Jesus, whatever your situation is, no matter how bad it is, boom, it's going to be over. You'll be all right. And the biggest mistake that church people make, and no offense, I'm not saying church people aren't Christians, they are, but there's a difference to me, having lived what I lived for 5 years, between a church person Christian and a true Christian. A church person Christian does what we all have a tendency to do. We judge based on what we see and not what we know. Now, if I'd have walked through these doors today and nobody knew who I was or anything about me, they would have never thought that I spent 5 years on the streets. And Mike will tell you, when I first started going to Tusculum, nobody there knew I was homeless when I walked through the door. Because he and Pastor Steve Cummings, who is still a dear friend of mine, they never told my story. But the thing about it was, the minute Steve talked me into telling my story, it was almost 60-40. 60% all of a sudden no longer walk up and shake my hand. They tried to avoid me. I love kids. We have 2 wonderful grandchildren, by the way, we're very proud of. We got a boy and a girl within about 6 months of each other. So.
And a dog?
And we have a dog. He's not really a dog.
No.
He's a human in dog form.
Okay.
And he's kind enough to let us reside in his house. And he actually lets us sleep in his bed. Yeah. And it's a nice bed. Yeah, that's Hondo. But kids that used to run up to me and, Mr. Steve, and I'd grab them and hug them and everything else. Not all of them, but some of the parents all of a sudden, that wasn't happening. So it wasn't long before I realized I needed to move on, church-wise. And I still pulled some stupid things while I was there. And hierarchies of church sometimes have difficulty with me because I don't hold anything back. When I speak at churches, I often say the biggest lies being told to the homeless community in Nashville, Tennessee are being told to them by church people, by Christians. After it became knowledge at Tusculum, I was still selling the contributor at that time. Even though I was off the streets, that's how I was still surviving. And the McDonald's where I was just 1.5 miles, 2 miles down the road from the church. So Steve came up to me, the pastor, after a month or so, after everybody now knowing who and it was amazing the ones that came up to me, I thought you looked familiar. He said, so how's business been? And I said, the same. He said, really? I said, yeah. And he said, any of the people from church stopping by and buying a paper? I said, one person. I said, now that they all put 2 and 2 together and knew I was there, they'd all honk at me as they went by. But only one stopped and bought a paper. And he looked at me and says, you know, I would like to say that surprises me, but it doesn't. And I told him, I said, let me tell you about my little business standing there selling the paper. I said, you know what the worst day of the week was for me selling the paper? Sunday. And I said, I would get to the corner pretty much 7 o'clock every morning. It was a business to me. It was a job. And I said, from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock, car after car after car after car would go by, but nobody was buying a paper. And I could tell 90% of them were on their way to church because they had the Bibles up in the window. They were all dressed for church. They weren't stopping. But at about 10 o'clock, 10:15, the script completely flipped. And for the next 2 hours, that was 2 of the best hours of the entire week, every Sunday. But you know who it was? It was the old Stevens of this world that had just spent all night long in a bar and a nightclub.
Really?
And they woke up and they were hungover and they didn't feel like making coffee. So a lot of them still in their pajamas, you know, they're going through and getting coffee and breakfast because they're hungover. You could tell by the bloodshot eyes. But they would pull up, that window would go down, and they wouldn't count. They'd just reach and grab and hand. But guess what happened after 12 o'clock? The church crowd started coming back through. And I would stand there for 2 hours and do nothing. And as I've told that story, I get told a lot, well, why would you give them money? They're just going to go buy more booze, or they're just going to buy drugs. You know, they're just alcoholics and addicts. I'm not going to waste my money. And I said, you know what? God tells us to give. What they do with it is between them and Him.
Our responsibility is to give.
That's it.
Yeah. We're about out of time, and I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but I would like you to tell the story about you're in the motel and pretty despondent, and you're taking a bunch of pills. A God thing happened there.
Yeah, it was, I had made a promise to myself that I would not spend another holiday season on the streets. That was the hardest time of the year, and it always is for the homeless, because you see all these people celebrating Christmas and Thanksgiving and, you know, families and everything else, and you've got nothing to celebrate. So I just told myself, I'll never do it. I'll never spend another one. And I tried everything I could, but nothing worked. And I knew that I wasn't going to be off the streets. So I'd never done drugs, never drank. But I started buying up pills because I was still at that point in my life. If I made a promise to myself, I pretty much kept it to myself. Nobody else. Didn't keep any other promises hardly at all, but I made a promise to myself. So I started buying up pills and started saving up money. And Christmas Eve, 2013, I went over to, and when I speak publicly, I went over to the luxurious Hallmark Inn on Trinity Lane. And I still remember it was $19 a room. I could afford it. So I paid for the room, and I went up and I took a shower, and I went across the street. The Waffle House was still open. So I ate, and I came back, and I said, I sat down and I said, it's time. It's time. And I was calm. I was good. I was actually relieved in some ways. And I'd written a letter to my 2 brothers that were still alive. My father died while I was in prison. My 2 oldest brothers, and my mother died after I got out and was living on the streets, but I wasn't allowed to attend their funerals. But to the 2 I had left, I wrote a letter, and I wrote one to her, to what I then knew was the one true love of my life, and it always had been. And that was Andy. And I poured the pills out, had the cup sitting there, and the next thing I know, there's a knock on the door. And I'm kind of startled, and as I turn around to look at the door, I catch the little AM/FM clock radio. Now, when I had sat down and said it was time, it was 9 o'clock. Well, as I turned to look at the door because somebody's knocking on it, it says 11 o'clock. And now all of a sudden I'm sitting in a chair with no arms, just an old straight back chair, pills still there, everything just like it was, but it's 2 hours later. So I'm like, my mind is, and then there's another knock on the door. This one a little louder. And it says, "Sir, housekeeping, are you checking out or are you staying over?" It wasn't 11 o'clock Christmas Eve night. It was 11 o'clock Christmas Day. And I would love to say at that moment that was my hallelujah come to Jesus moment, but I wasn't quite there yet. I was still kind of confused. But I reached into my pocket and I figured I had enough money, and I said, "I'm going to stay over. I'll come down in just a minute and pay." So I went down and I paid. I had $8.32, I think, left over. And I ran across, there was a little mini Mapco. It wasn't even a full big size Mapco. It was a mini Mapco. So the pickings were slim. And I bought me some Cokes and some chips and some cupcakes and some cookies. And I tell people I went back, I turned on the TV, I plopped down on that bed. One of the best Christmases I've ever had in my life. And that started my journey, my real journey from chains to change. And it wasn't long after that that I realized that God had never deserted me. Through everything that I went through what was happening to me when I was 12 years old, to what happened to me in that shower room floor in Mississippi State Penitentiary, to the 3 unsuccessful suicide attempts, the other 2 times, the automobile accident, and the time the robber pointed a gun in my face and pulled the trigger twice and it never went off. Through all of those things, through my 5 years on the streets, God was always there, or I wouldn't be sitting here tonight. And my message has been since then, and always will be, you are never, never too far gone for God. You may be too far gone for family. You may be too far gone for man, but you are never, ever too far gone for God.
Thank you so much for
Thank
sharing
you.
your story.
Thank you.
The contact information for Home Street Home.
HomestreetHomeTN.org is our website.
Okay.
Of course, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter.
Okay.
All the social platforms. If you would like to contact me personally, my number is public. My number is 615-992-5762. I answer it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Okay.
So it's been a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate it. God bless you.
The book is called From Chains to Change, and you can get this on Amazon.com. Toward the end of the book, and you said this earlier, our Heavenly Father loves us more than we can imagine. When all else fails and others abandon you and pain sets in, hold on to his promise. In Deuteronomy 31:6, he will never leave you nor forsake you, as you said. He found me, and I know he can find you. Do you have a story of amazing grace? Take time to share it with someone this week, and we'll see you next time on Stories of Amazing Grace. Thanks for coming by.